Yeah, hello, my name is Michael Taylor. I'm the Head of Regional Affairs at Manchester Metropolitan University. In my spare time, I also blog, and I'm a Governor of Aquinas College in Stockport and the Link Governor for Employability as well. And I'm delighted to be here with you, my old friend Frank, today.
Welcome to the Downtown Zen, Michael. And listen, before we get into the various challenges of your present role, let's talk about when we first met.
Yeah.
You were editor of Fine magazine at Northwest Business Insider, and your time there, because you were there for a considerable number of years.
Yeah, I pitched up in year 2000. Nick Jaspin, the owner at the time, I applied for the job when I've been working in London, and I did 12 years in total, Frank, and in that time we grew the business. Not only did we have the Northwest magazine, which I was the day-to-day editor of, we also expanded into the events sphere, which is something you're obviously very good at as well, and developed an online presence, which it basically didn't exist when we first started. And we also expanded regionally. So we had insiders by the time I left in the Midlands, which was an acquisition, Yorkshire, which was an expansion, and Wales and the Southwest as well. And also doing events in other parts of the country, such as Milton Keynes and Belfast, which is cities I'd never worked in before.
I bet you Milton Keynes was the highlight. And so in terms of your time there, so 12 years, clearly there were changes then that occurred during your time as editor. And, you know, I recall Insider was very much the business Bible during that period of time. And you launched some fabulous initiatives as well, things that are still going today, such as 42 under 42, for example, celebrating young entrepreneurs in the region. A fantastic gossip page right at the back of the magazine, which again is still part of the publication. But I remember when Insider used to drop through your letterbox, it was like a tomb, you know, it was a thud. It could wake you up because it was such a fantastic missive of information. And, you know, you could take a month to actually get through it if you wanted to know the detail of what was happening across the Northwest. Now, this is no criticism of the people who are currently involved in the magazine, but of course we live in a very different world now. And so Insider comes through your door and is, you know, a much slimmer publication. I think the organisation, the magazine, will concede that it probably makes more money through its events than it does through the publication itself. And then, as you say, you've moved it towards more digital platforms as well. But alongside other regional publications and media, there are some significant challenges. I just wanted to get your thoughts on where you think we're going, because, you know, I think local newspapers are really struggling now.
Yeah.
And more worrying for me is the standard of journalism and whether or not we can actually afford the investigative type of journalistic approach that you were certainly great at, and many others in the region have been in the past as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big, expansive question, Frank, and I'm glad you added the caveat that a lot of other local media have faced a similar shrinkage in regional print advertising budgets and have had to diversify accordingly. It's the same right across business-to-business publishing as well. You'll notice lots of other trade publications, some of them that might fall into your orbit. Let's take the property industry as an example as well. Estates Gazette, Property Week, all of those. They used to land on your doormat with a thud as well. So did the sector that I used to work in before I entered the regional business market, which was broadcasting trade. You know, it was a rich number of competitive titles, and print advertising has dropped down. And the single biggest factor in that is the internet, because people have that ability to be able to reach niche audiences in a measurable, quantifiable way with very, very targeted advertising. And the main recipient of that revenue, unfortunately, has not been the publications that have managed to diversify, but Google and Facebook. And they don't share out the benefit of their riches, despite every effort by the management of all the media companies to make their products Facebook friendly, SEO compliant, and frankly, we mean Google by that. And the big tech companies have completely cornered the market in what was once a very rich domestic media market. And businesses have had to try and diversify. I have every amount of sympathy with the people running any media business at the moment and the challenges thereof. I have very limited day-to-day contact with them, but my one bit of contact at the moment is my good friend Chris Bird has purchased Quest Media, a local media group in Tameside, which has a website, ambitions to do local community events in Tameside, in Ashton, Stalybridge, Hyde, places like that. And I worked with him on a few election events for the general election just gone, and he's very kindly given me a berth playing my favourite music on Sunday nights on a programme called Music Therapy. But Chris is a good friend, and I've talked long into the night with him about some of the challenges that they're having to face in trying to be a hyper-local product. And that's maybe where there's an opportunity. Whereas the Manchester Evening News, which is obviously the biggest media product in that market, is still omnipresent. What I will say, in absolute fairness, is there is no better journalist covering political affairs in this country at the moment, to my mind, than Jennifer Williams at the Manchester Evening News. And there is no journalist more hardworking than her. I don't say this because she's a close friend or anything, and I'm just bigging up my pals. I do have a healthy professional relationship with her, but that's totally born of respect. She does the hard yards. She gets stuff leaked to her because people trust her, but she also rings people up all the time just for a chat to find out what's going on, what they take. And I think that's maybe one of the lost arts of journalism that people don't do enough of. There have been a few other journalists around the patch who've done that as well. I thought Jessica Middleton-Pugh, when in her time as the editor of Place Northwest, made a good job of doing that as well. And I think their events have been pretty good on the whole. But people get their news and information from different sources now. And obviously social media is a big source of that. Like you, the first thing I often do in the morning when I wake up with my cup of coffee, you scroll through your curated feed of news, which I think we always anticipated that might happen with technology. But that's happened through the forum of Twitter.
Yeah.
And I think that's become a really broken forum. It's not a pleasant place to be. I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm not on it very much anymore. I don't like the toxicity of it. I think whatever it is you want to go on Twitter and comment about, A, you're never going to change anybody's mind. And B, you're going to get in a row in about 10 seconds flat. You can't have a disagreement or an opinion about anything from Everton, Liverpool, the price of fish in Marple, where I live, anything. It's all just so angry. And so I've just taken a decision, apart from when I'm punting out my music program at the moment and boast, and it's still I've still got 5,500 followers, so I quite like them to read my blog from time to time. So I drop it onto Twitter, but I aggressively block people who pursue us. Our university's had its own issues, as you might know, in the last month around the return of students. And that in itself has attracted unbelievable adverse and misinformed comment that our team, who are brilliant, by the way, have to deal with day to day. So I don't know how you do it, Frank, with a brilliant, well-connected business organisation like yours. It's a massive challenge in how to conduct yourself online. I think you probably do it quite well. I'm as interested in what you've got to say as I am, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that, as with all media, you've got to be authentic. So it's no good us having a load of guidelines, rules, regulations in place to say to our team, and certainly to say to me, you can tweet this, but you can't tweet that, or you can say this, you can't say that. I've been embroiled in arguments that, the day after you wake up and you think, why do they even bother? Because as you rightly say, Michael, you're never going to convince the person that you're debating with. And anyway, what a daft forum, in a sense, to embark upon discussions and debates, because the complex issues that you tend to be drawn into, football aside, which can tend to be a bit daft, but if you're talking about what the government strategy for COVID should be and how you balance the economic needs and the health needs, then how are you supposed to do that with 140 characters or whatever it is? It's nonsense, isn't it? So I think I've probably drawn the conclusion that you have, that I've tried to be more disciplined in terms of what we do post on there, and certainly what I personally post on there. I had to, almost be handcuffed to the radiator last night when Manchester United got beat 6-1, followed by Liverpool being drubbed 7-2 at Aston Villa, to not take to social media. But joking aside, I do think that when people like you start to decide it's more hassle than it's worth, that's when social media platforms are in trouble. And I've thought for some time, I came off Facebook years ago.
Okay.
I've used
Interesting.
For ages. I think LinkedIn is far too busy, complex, complicated. I don't find that easy to use. And likewise, as I say, I think Twitter's becoming a more unattractive place to be for the reasons you've outlined. So we need something, but perhaps it's time for something new to emerge.
Well, I've started to submerge myself in the comfortable, loving balm of Instagram and all the fakery and beautiful people of that. Mainly, it's, as you know, I do enjoy the outdoors, and so it's lots of pictures of mountain ranges from all over the world, superimposed with people who've taken far too long to compose a picture of them looking handsome or beautiful in front of a mountain range or a tree. But I must admit, I find that a lot more comfortable and soothing than I do spending time on any version of Twitter, be it political, sporting. There's even splits within my own community of fans who support my football team, the happy clappers and the angry brigade, and I can't be doing with it. I dip in and out.
And I suppose the other thing I'd just say before we leave the subject of media is that it reflects in a sense where we are as a country, doesn't it? Because we do have a far more polarized community now. So again, if you reflect on your time at Insider, it was a new Labour government. Consensus politics was very much in vogue, not just in the UK, but right across Europe and the States as well. Whereas now, 20 years on, we are in a place, sadly, I say sadly, in my opinion, sadly, where everything's black and white. There are no grey areas. It seems to me that, as I say, places like Twitter in particular reflect that. But I think it also brings pressure to local journalists as well. Because whereas in the past you would see journalists reporting issues, I find myself now having to look a couple of times at a story that's published, whether it be by Jennifer or Liam over here in Liverpool, and there's other reporters as well that I follow on social media, and often it's their opinion. And I think that's where we're slipping into dangerous territory, because if you start to confuse news with opinion, that's when you can get into real trouble.
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to say that, Frank, but it's an opinion of interpretation. But I think we've moved into what I call, it's the culture war, isn't it? People refer to that all the time. And I think there are really hard dividing lines now in the culture war between, you can almost predict what people's opinions are going to be on a whole range of issues. probably including supporting Liverpool. And then all those different issues on that trajectory, and where they're going to take a stance. I think it's the same in sports journalism as well. And people utilize social media for the shock value.
Yeah.
I had a quick look at Twitter and your feed just before I came on for this chat, and the subject that's trending is Souness. Yeah, because Sky News, obviously, they punt out their most vociferous shock jocks. That's what he's become, and I don't mean that because he's Scottish, by the way. Apologies for any Scottish people out there. Just as he apologised for his comments on Latinos, but it's what I call the conveyor belt of outrage, that people are constantly looking to put items on that belt to keep it going round.
Yeah.
And I think the BBC play that to a certain extent as well. We've seen that ourselves with the way that we've had to handle news management in the last couple of weeks around our sector. It's always that someone's always that person on Twitter, and I guess the trick is never to be that person on Twitter, the one that everybody hates, be it Lawrence Fox, Graham Souness, and occasionally, to be fair, in the Greater Manchester context, Jennifer Williams. Yeah, she has a heck of a ride of it with the abuse she gets.
Yeah, and neither you or I would ever condone that sort of behaviour. And it's a tough gig being a journalist now.
Yeah.
But listen, you got out and decided to go and do other things with your life, and
including working with you, which was great, Frank. The events you put on, the access to people that you've got, the things that we did together. I always look back on that very, very fondly.
Yeah, we had a good 18 months, didn't we?
A bit longer than that, but yeah.
A bit longer than that. Well, you see, time flies when you're having fun, Michael.
Yeah.
So I thought about 18 months, but when you shared downtown Manchester in business, which was a great time for us as well, because we were relatively new in the city at that time. And of course, the other thing that you did was you penned, I thought, a magnificent piece of work, 40 by 40. So tell us how that came about. And you're chuckling there, but I tell you, for those who might not have read it, it's a cracking read. And
thank you, Frank.
A real story of its time, in my opinion.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's a comic novel set against the backdrop of the financial crash of 2008, set in Alderley Edge and Manchester, with a central character very much based on a character that I created as a column in Insider that people didn't realise was a fictional character called Roger Cashman. And I changed his name for the publication, to Roger Cashmore, which in many ways was better. I sometimes think about that. There's a whole tradition going on in, a whole shift going on in male fiction at the moment over the last few years. And if I was to do it again, I wouldn't have called it 40 by 40, which was a pun. I should probably have called it To the Edge. I should probably have called myself Mick Taylor, because it sounds harder. And I wouldn't have done a nice blue and colourful cover. I'd have done a black cover with a dagger emerging, because crime fiction and hard-boiled violent crime is actually the thing that sells. So, I'm really chuffed and touched by what you've said about it. That's really kind, Frank. And I was pleased to have been shortlisted to get in the final of Pulp Idol, which is the first time Writers' Prize held in Liverpool by the Writing on the Wall Festival. That was a real achievement. And yeah, maybe I'll return to it one day. At the moment, my writing is, I've just completed a master's thesis in political science. That's where a lot of my energy's gone into in the last year. But, the encouraging words you've given me will, maybe I should return to it. Maybe I could do a book about the next phase of Roger Cashmore's life after the end of 2008, where maybe he considers a move into politics and stands in an unwinnable seat with hilarious consequences.
Well, I'd certainly be front of the queue to buy that. So it sounds like a plan, that actually. In terms of where books are at the moment, I'd have to agree with that. I'm a big fan of Tony Parsons as another one.
Sorry, that's the example I should have used, really.
Some of the stuff he did in the early days, was far different. He's moved into that crime novel now, hasn't he? Which is, but you know, I must admit, I preferred his earlier stuff.
And it's the same with Christopher Brookmeyer, who's now Chris Brookmeyer. And instead of writing novels about a jolly journalist in Edinburgh and the capers he gets up to, you know, it's dark. It's almost Ian Rankin Rebus stuff.
Yeah.
And I guess probably the best writer working in Manchester at the moment in fiction is Joseph Knox, who really is a literary writer, classically trained. But his books are hard-boiled Manchester crime fiction with a flawed character with drug and alcohol issues. And that's, you know, that's the market we've got to look into.
Yeah. Well, quickly moving on. So you, as I say, had a stint with us, which was great, working alongside you, and you were doing one or two other bits and pieces as well. You actually stood as a parliamentary candidate as well for the Labour Party at one point.
Yeah, I did. I've now stood unsuccessfully in 2 elections. The 2015 general election for Ed Miliband's Labour Party, as an unashamed supporter of New Labour. I was selected in my local home constituency of Hazel Grove. I took our vote from roughly 5,000 votes in 2010 to 7,500 votes in that election, with a good campaign. You know, it was at the expense of the local Liberal Democrats who lost the seat. They've never forgiven me for that. And then I left the Labour Party, as you know, and I supported Anne Coffey and Luciana, who actually was introduced to by you, and stood for the Independent Group for Change in the ill-fated European Parliament elections on their ticket in the Northwest. I still think something had to be done to bring Labour to its senses, and I'm very proud of the role that I played in doing that. And I think the choice that people faced in those elections was fairly clear. I think the choice that people faced in the general election of 2019 was possibly the worst choice anyone has ever faced in this country. I described it at the time as the choice between the smirk and the scowl. And I think every fear that I ever had about Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister, which I didn't. I voted Liberal Democrat, which was difficult for me because I really didn't like the candidate I voted for. I didn't like the party and their platform. I won't repeat what you and I have shared about them in the past. It's the worst kind of opportunistic pavement politics. I've no respect for it. But I ended up voting for them locally, and they still didn't win against their local MP around here, William Ragg, who's now won 3 times. Yeah. Personally, I have a smidgen of respect for him. He's a Brexiteer. But I also have to work with him now, Frank. You know, I should probably pull my punches a little bit. He does a lot of good local work. And obviously we disagree on Brexit. We disagree on his support for Boris Johnson, who's been, I think, an utter disaster as the Prime Minister.
I'm interested in the comment you made about, you know, you feeling that there was a need for a breakaway group, the independent group. And of course, people broke away from the Tory party as well.
Yeah.
Again, probably a sign of the times that they didn't even get the sort of leverage that the Social Democratic Party got. Goes back to the comment I made earlier, that people are seeing politics now in very black and white terms.
Yeah.
Do you think we may be moving into a period where a Keir Starmer type approach, which clearly is more consensual, certainly more to the centre than anything that Jeremy Corbyn had to say, for example, an opportunity there? Or do you think that he may end up getting caught between a new Farage type party and the Tories?
I don't know. I don't have a dog in the fight anymore. I am silently on the sidelines willing Starmer to succeed because I think it's the only route to an alternative to this absolute disaster that's unfolding in front of us, with the response to COVID, the response to Brexit. Breaks my heart to see the way our country's gone. I think Starmer's been really impressive. Yeah. But that it's all behind me now, really. And, you know, I've got to work with whatever politicians we've got. One of the projects I've always been politically very passionate about. I think Britain should have a more federal structure. And I have applauded every attempt at devolution, even the ones that you didn't support back in the early 2000s, when you were on the same side as Dominic Cummings in not supporting a yes vote in the referendum. See, I remember these things, Frank. And I'm a great supporter of what the Metro mayors have done, both what Andy Burnham has done in Greater Manchester and what Andy Street has done in the West Midlands, and to a different extent, although I don't watch it as closely and it's not clearly as important, what Ben Houchin has been doing in the Tees Valley as well. I think it's demonstrated where people can show aptitude and local leadership. It's just what this country needs. And the institutions that can line up alongside people like the Andys, I think shows a much better and more optimistic future. There was a piece in The Economist last week describing Andy Burnham as probably the only politician in Britain who's had a good COVID. And I agree with that. And in many ways, my decision to leave the Labour Party before the Independent Group for Change came about, there's a whole number of different local factors as well. But one of the things that kept me in was what Andy Burnham was doing in Manchester. But ultimately, you didn't have to be a Labour supporter to support what he's doing, because he was reaching out to a much broader constituency, including, the members of downtown who, he supports and speaks to at your events, which are always really illuminating, and other different groups, the way he engages with the charitable sector, the way he's brought together a different coalition and shown a different way of working that cuts across the culture wars and cuts across the divisive politics by engaging, for instance, with people in the private sector to solve the issue of street homelessness and rough sleeping. That's been remarkable. I mean, for someone to have pulled that off in the way that he has, and the fact that the Labour Party, when Corbyn was leader, never thought to ask how they pulled it off. One of the great social policy almost demands from a civilized society to prevent its people from sleeping on the streets, and to say, well, how have you done it in Manchester, Andy? Never thought to ask. So
I shouldn't laugh really, but I think it is laughable, some of the things that happened during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. And, I've had many debates and discussions, as you can imagine, particularly about the many flaws within the approach that he and his team took. And I'm sure it's on your reading list if you've not read it already. Left Out.
Oh, I've already read it and reviewed it.
Fascinating, fascinating publication, and a further evidence of the failure of that whole project. I have to say, I don't think Ed Miliband's Labour Party was much better, to be honest, but nothing as bad as. But listen, I think.
No, Frank, I'll concede a point to you, though. Yeah, I think you were hinting at saying, that I look back and think I did the right thing by supporting the Independent Group for Change and the need for a new centre party. At the time, I thought Labour was gone. And I think events have subsequently proved there's been life in the sensible wing of the Labour Party. I heard Bridget Phillipson on the Today programme this morning. There was no voice for people like Bridget, who's a real progressive thinker. There was no room for people like Alison McGovern, who I know you know very well, and yet now, and Wes Streeting, who we've spoken with in the last few months as well. These people are now moving into the mainstream of British politics, whereas they've been at the fringes, or they had one foot in the camp and one foot out, like people like Mike Cain and Jonathan Reynolds, who are good friends of mine. I thought Labour had gone and they'd had to compromise too far, but I think maybe I've been proved wrong in that pessimism back then, but I don't regret anything for a minute.
I think that it was difficult for anybody during a particular period of Labour's recent history, even people like me with an emotional attachment to the organisation from the age of 17. I've been, but there was always that instinct within you that said, we will come through this eventually, and fortunately that's been proved to be the case. And can I just say as well, and I know you'll share this opinion, as much as I've been a Labour voter, Labour supporter all my adult life, the fact is that, you know, I want to see two very strong political parties, more than two if it's possible, but certainly the two mainstream parties, Labour and Conservative, challenging each other, coming up with new ideas, basically making demands of the other party, because it makes society better. I want to see, you know, the government succeed, whether people were red. And, you know, my despondency in the past 5 years has been to see what has appeared to be a fairly rudderless government not being held to account in the way that it ought to have been, because you have a poor opposition. Yeah. So, you know, I speak to many friends who are Conservatives, and they will say, much better now that we've got a credible opposition leader, because it will have the resultant impact of the Conservative Party having to sharpen its pencil and not be as flippant, and I use that word advisedly, in the approach it takes in the future.
Yeah, fair point.
But listen, your role at Manchester Met is to keep your finger on the pulse of all things political, national, and of course regional. You do have great relationships with local MPs and Andy Burnham and others. And in terms of Manchester at the moment, what are the issues that are exercising the minds of the university, but also the wider stakeholder within that university setting? Because you work with the private sector and others as well, of course. Yeah,
the biggest challenge of all, we can't duck it at the moment, is the fact that our university opened for the new autumn term a week ahead of everyone else. We have 38,000 students. It's an enormous university, one of the biggest in the country. And unfortunately, COVID has spiked. There's been an outbreak of coronavirus in Manchester, as we all know. And we've had to put under lockdown, following advice from Manchester City Council and Public Health England, 2 of our halls of residence. And that's had an enormous effect on the day-to-day workings of the university. A lot of students are having to do online-only learning, whilst practically, well, they've used the phrase, and the media have used the phrase, imprisoned in their apartment, in their student flats. And it's been a really tough time for them. And the university has been pulling out all the stops to support the students. And, you know, I've had very little to do with that. We have got an amazing security and support team who've been looking to reassure members of the local community that these students are going to behave well and conduct themselves in what is a, you know, part of inner city Manchester. And we've also got an amazing comms team as well, which have had to keep the messages going to the students that they've been supported. And the university has supported them. They're going to be refunded rent, but it's been a really tough time. You know, it can't not take its toll on individual colleagues, as I've witnessed over the last couple of weeks. But, you know, they're digging in, they're doing a good job, and they're really, really focused on helping our students to continue to learn. And yeah, it's online and it's not ideal. It's not the start any of them would have wanted. But we've had to provide reassurance from the team that I work in to people like our MP, Lucy Powell, who's done a great job, very fair. She wanted assurances that the university was acting as a good local stakeholder in her community, and our local councillors as well in Hume. They've been great. They've been not only supporting the students, but also reassuring members of the local community. And we've been, my colleague Josie Sykes has been liaising with them brilliantly. And also, you know, the mayor, Andy, went on the Today programme last Monday, and you know, I was able to put him in contact with our Vice Chancellor before he did so, which again, you know, it speaks volumes both for Malcolm Press, our VC, and for Andy, that they've got that relationship, that we as a team have got that relationship with our senior politicians, that they can, you know, they can be interviewed. I'm sure if that had happened in many other cities around the country, that their local university would have been thrown under a bus by local politicians. But I think it's a measure of the relationships of respect that we've built up, that we deliver on what we say we're going to do. We do things in partnership. that Andy was able to take those soundings and give a good account of what he knew was happening on the ground.
Mm. And in terms of building those relationships, I guess that is part of your role, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Or that, you know, those links are strong, maintained. And so, you know, when challenges do emerge, then, as you say, you've got that sort of quick way in and access to those people. Equally, though, the university plays a huge role beyond,
of course,
its educational function, and therefore, you know, it's a genuine partner in the whole economic ecosystem of Manchester. Yeah. It's not simply, well, give us your students, we'll look after them and forget the rest. You involve yourselves and engage yourselves in many, many other aspects of Manchester life.
Yeah, we have to. And there's an emerging agenda in the higher education sector called the Civic University Agenda. You know, if you remember back to when I went to university in 1985, I was one of 10% of 18, 19-year-olds who would take that option. And I was very fortunate to do so. Now it's closer to 40 to 50%. That's not consistent across all economic groups, by the way. It's almost, you know, the vast majority of middle-class kids get to go to university. But more and more students from what we would call non-traditional backgrounds are coming to university. And they come to universities like ours. So they've not and they come with BTEC qualifications often, not A-levels. They come from both socioeconomic and ethnic groups that aren't necessarily used to the rhythms of a university life. So our moral responsibility to them to have a good education is massive. And one of the outcomes by which that investment that they make in their future is measured is by the kind of job they're going to get, the kind of life that they're going to lead. Now, they're not necessarily all going to go and get a job for Goldman Sachs, maybe like nobody necessarily does from any university. But, you know, there is a traditional cliche that says that they join this treadmill that gets them high-paid jobs in the city. That's not necessarily the case. Many of our students look to find a job in Manchester. And because Manchester is the city it is, and the city that's growing to the extent it is, with all, you know, the activities of many of the members of organisations like yours, Frank, in the private sector in the city, students want to stick around. It's a great city to be a part of. It's a city going places. And often students find themselves not quite knowing where to go next. Mm-hmm. Our challenge is to make sure that they get graduate level jobs when they leave, that they're not sticking around for a couple of years, waiting on tables. Well, in an ideal world, there's not a lot of that going on either at the moment. So it's work with the private sector. We have to work to make sure that they get good jobs and enjoy everything that Manchester has to offer. I'll give you one example to illustrate that. We produce something called, we've developed a product called degree apprenticeships, where large employers ranging from Lloyds Bank, IBM, AstraZeneca, to give 3 examples, work with us, and they effectively put their students on a sandwich course, to quote some old examples. And at the end of that 4-year process, where they study at university a couple of days a week, or about 40% of their time, they come out with a degree at the end of it, and without the tuition fees that they would have had to pay. So it's and we've got 2,000 students now studying with us, with their employers on a degree apprenticeship, and we're pretty good at it. Liz Gorb and Jonathan, who run that team, are absolutely top draw, and they've got great relationships. And we have to think, how can we make lots of different dimensions to those relationships? How can we make employers want to do lots more with us? What executive education can they do? This country's been terrible at leadership in the past. How can we produce better leaders, better managers at a ground level? And there's all sorts of things that I think we can offer and develop a much more rounded product that a university can play its part in educating its executive workforce. And also we have to introduce our students to employment opportunities, and that means working with organisations like yours, Frank, but also with organisations like Mr. Digital Pro Manchester, the CBI, the local chambers of commerce, so that they all understand what our students are capable of and what projects they can work on, and that each course that a student studies at our university has that applied learning element to it. For those that work with businesses. Having said that, we also have more students graduating from our university who go into education to become teachers, nurses, social workers. You know, the very people that we stood on our doorsteps at the beginning of this pandemic and applauded for, you know, they're our graduates. They're the people that are making a real civic contribution to the life of our city region. And we also have to step up to the plate. We're not we don't have a medical school, so we're not going to find a cure for COVID, but we can be part of the solution to some of the problems the pandemic's thrown up. Mm. So, you know, our Fashion Institute, for instance, worked with the prisons industries to produce face masks and PPE equipment at a time when our NHS, which had been so badly let down, was badly in need of product. Mm. And again, we were throwing our resources and our time at producing solutions like that.
And, you know, what you've outlined there, Michael, is universities need these days to be far more innovative and expansive in terms of what you offer, because you are in a market and you're a business yourselves, and so it's important that you react to those markets. But I was interested to hear comments about Manchester and being the city it is. And again, you know, you and I go back far enough to remember when Manchester wasn't perhaps that buzzing place, that metropolis that we see nowadays, and you know, through a period in the doldrums, not that dissimilar, I have to say, to Liverpool and other northern cities, but it came out of that quicker than those other places, stronger. And I think civic leadership, alongside working with some great private sector entrepreneurs and creatives, and you know, I couldn't go through an hour-long conversation with you without mentioning the late, great Tony Wilson, of course. Yeah. But, you know, this COVID crisis has now put some strains on cities in particular. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on whether you think Manchester can bounce back, and if so, how it will do that.
I think it's really tricky. I think because of the very factors that I mentioned about why, as a country, we need a more federal, a more devolved political system, the very reason we haven't got that, are one of the very reasons why the ambitions the city has to build back better is because actually local governments suffered from austerity over the last 10 years, it is now, isn't it? Mm. They've been starved of resources. They have very few levers to pull. Devolution hasn't been followed through. We're expecting, in the course of the next 6 months, in a normal political environment, we'd be expecting an autumn budget, a white paper on devolution, a Greater Manchester spatial framework, a comprehensive spending review, and actually, what are we going to get out of any of that? Probably none of those. Yeah. I think the comprehensive spending review is essential, and Manchester's made its own submissions. For us, for our university, we've contributed to it, as of Salford and Manchester and Bolton. To be fair, we have, you know, we've got that maturity to do things together. There's talk as well that Dominic Cummings' hand is at play to do away with Greg Clark's version of what a local industrial strategy was. So both Cummings and COVID, between them, have unravelled lots of the opportunities for us to come out of this. And yet, I still see a great appetite for people to do things differently, as we're wont to say. Where I think there's been a slight difference, and I think there'll be a difference of emphasis, which might be behind the delay to the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, or to give it its full title, Greater Manchester's Plans for Jobs and Homes and Work, is an emphasis a bit less on the centre and the city centre and Salford Quays, and maybe a little bit more on district centres. You know, Andy Burnham has signed off a mayoral development corporation for Stockport, to build around the station and to do imaginative things there, that there's a need actually to spread the love a little bit for other nodes of employment, for other nodes of growth where people might want to live, to think a little bit differently. And if we're all working from home, as I am in the suburbs where you're speaking to me today, there have been 3 new bars opened in my local high street in the last few months. The next suburb along, Romilly, has got a number of little pop-up markets and shops that have happened. The cafes are buzzing during the day, whereas the cafes, obviously, that I'm not spending £3 on a latte, I'm spending it in my local district. And I think I've had this conversation on a couple of forums with Elise Wilson, the leader of Stockport, who's obviously a cabinet member. And I think it's starting to consume the thoughts of lots of people around that cabinet table about how Greater Manchester evolves, not just in the centre. That's going to be a tension. That's going to be a tension that's going to have to be resolved at some point as well, because I think COVID has changed the way people use our city centres. And what goes on in those city centres. Are they nodes of employment? Are they going to be places where people, what's the nighttime and daytime economy is going to look like? Very different, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And
we are in a period, I think, of transformation, more radical than you and I probably ever seen, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't write off cities as much as some people are, and I think they will reinvent themselves, but they will have to reinvent. They won't be able to just go back to what they were pre-COVID. And I think the other point that you've raised a couple of times now, and that I, certainly support, and as you know, as an organisation we support, is that devolution take. Yeah. Because if this has proved anything, this crisis, it's that, the limited powers and responsibilities local government has had, and the limited powers and responsibilities and soft power that mayors enjoy, has actually been used far more effectively and efficiently than anything from the central executive. And therefore, if there was ever a time to step up the articulation for that devolution to be accelerated, then it's now. Yeah. And actually, the pressure that's going to come from Scotland for independence will, I think, mean that the north of England, the Midlands, will be saying, well, what about us? Because we have been massively let down by the current structure of government.
Yeah, and I guess the Conservatives are on a ticking clock as well.
Yeah.
Because the seats, like Andy Burnham's old seat of Lee, like many other seats across Greater Manchester, the Boltons in Bury, have gone blue.
Yeah. And
all those swathe of seats across Yorkshire. I'll tell you that you like this story. You mentioned Insider earlier. I had a call from an old colleague at Insider. We had a catch up just to see how each other were. He was Andy Coyne, a big Villa fan who's going to be very happy today. He rang me and, how are you, mate? How's the family? All that sort of thing. And then he went, have you heard about Mark Eastwood? And I thought he was going to tell me he was dead. And he was a salesman that we worked with in the Yorkshire office. And I was like, oh no, what? He went, he's the MP for Dewsbury. I mean, I never heard Mark express a political opinion in all the time I worked with him. And, after he left, he obviously got involved in Tory local politics, and he got put up to stand in the general election. And to everybody's surprise, probably not the least his, I now used to work with the MP for Dewsbury. And these aren't necessarily people you would have expected to have become Conservative MPs, with the greatest respect that I've got for Mark as a good old boy. But that's and it's places like that. In 4 years' time, they're going to be turning around and going, so where's this levelling up that you promised us? Where are the jobs coming from? And they can't just click their fingers and make it happen. They can't revive Stoke in a heartbeat, or Dewsbury, or huge parts of Greater Manchester. Merseyside's not the same.
No.
But but certainly though that crumbling of the red wall is a big challenge for Labour, and they're clearly very focused on it. But it's a big challenge for Boris Johnson, because if he doesn't meet it, something else will. Because that discontent isn't going away.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's going to be when we get through COVID, that's going to be the battleground for the two major parties. And as I say, whatever may emerge from the right, which I think Nigel Farage seems to be on manoeuvres at the moment. So we're not going to wait too long to find out what that is. Now listen, before we finish our conversation, Michael, I just wanted to, because we've covered a wide range of things today, but I wanted to touch on something that I know has been real, genuine interest to you, and will be probably even more important at this moment in time, particularly given your own in the university and the young people that you ultimately are responsible for, and that's mental health.
Yeah.
Because it's something that has never been talked about as much, but I don't think it's any better understood in many respects. I think all the noise, it's great. It's nice that people can come out now and say, yeah, you know, I've suffered from depression. I've had bouts of times when I've been down and I've thought about all sorts of horrible things and doing things, self-harm and so on. But we're going through a period of our history now where we're going to be seeing this problem, this challenge, being even worse, if anything.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not sensing, certainly at central government level, any major response to that. You know, we're not talking about, well, where are the resources going to come from to actually ensure that at the end of this, we've got a support infrastructure in place to talk to those young people who are going through the sort of times that, you know, you spoke about the students. That's a horrible situation.
Yeah.
But I tell you, and you'll know this, there's people in far worse situations.
There are.
What are we going to do about that? And you know, not just young people, but I think it's a ticking time bomb, mate. I really do.
Yeah, no, you're right. So articulate it, Frank. And the good point is, yeah, we're talking about it now, but and you're right. Lots of people talk about it, but it's a different conversation that we've come such a long way. You know, I think people like Alistair Campbell, and to be fair to him, Nick Clegg, when he was in the coalition government, they did raise it as an issue. Like so many of the other issues, they couldn't make it actually an element of practical policy. But the fact that employers are, you know, it's not the taboo that it once was for employers. I remember doing appraisals for people, and if anybody ever wrote the S word, stress, on their appraisal form, oh yeah, I get a bit stressed from time to time, that rung a massive alarm bell, and that you kind of mobilize the forces around to make sure what that was, and you manage it. I think we've all been through those instances with both people we manage, and I think there has been an improvement in understanding and breaking the taboo. I don't think we should underestimate that. That's been a big part and a big plus and a positive. I'm okay with that. What we do about it is an issue of resource.
Yeah.
And the NHS is crumbling as it is.
Yeah.
And particularly, we're facing a massive mental health crisis as a result of people's changed circumstances. You know, the things that trigger people are instability of work and relationship breakdown more than anything else. Any circumstances at work, whether they work for the public sector, whether they work in the private sector, the military, whatever it is, it's circumstances at work and circumstances in personal relationships that are going to be the trigger factors that have a detrimental effect on people's mental health. The fact employers are talking about it is good, but the fact that the NHS, that there are enormous waiting times for people. You know, it's great if you're earning a few quid and you can go and do something about it and go and see a therapist, and great. But for lots of people, that isn't an option for them. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think the advocacy that you'll be able to give, Frank, as a business organisation with the clout that you've got and the ears that you've got, and I think it's really important that you make it a central plank of what you do to keep that awareness up for people. And, you know, I'm more than happy to work with you both from the university point of view and with other stakeholders that we can bring together to, you know, how we live better. There's a project I've been involved in called Live Better Manchester that's brought people together. And a friend of mine I mentioned earlier has been involved in, Chris Bird. You know, let's see what we can do together, you know, to accelerate that.
Absolutely. Well, as you know, we're always open to good
I know you are.
that meet good objectives. and it'd be good to work alongside you again. And there's another project that we won't talk about now that we might well be launching again in the not too distant future as well. So watch this space as far as that's concerned. Listen, mate, it's always great to catch up with you. It's been too long. We're long overdue a coffee. Maybe I'll nip over to Marple and
you can. You'd be very welcome.
Find one of those little local places and we can have a drink in there. But listen, you look after yourself, and I'll see you very soon in face-to-face, hopefully, mate.
Lovely. Great to talk to you, Frank.
Brilliant. Thanks. That's Michael Taylor, who's at Manchester Met. Been great to speak to him today. And that's it from the Downtown Den. We'll see you all again very soon.